Hey guys, this is Katie from Girl Scout Troop 455, and today me and two other girls from my Girl Scout troop will be teaching y'all how to engineer. Engineering can be a bunch of different things. It can be anything from making a birdhouse like we did in this video to solving problems for computers like a computer engineer or a civil engineer, stuff like that. It can be anything as long as you follow a few simple steps. First of all, you need to identify a problem. Is there anything maybe going on around you or in your community or in your workplace or your school? Maybe needs some improvement or needs to be fixed. So stuff like that. This is what engineering is all about. Next, you need to come up with a solution. How are you going to fix your problem? You got to make sure it's doable. It's not too ambitious or way out there. It's got to be something you can actually do. Next, you have to make a model. This is the application part and where you're testing out whether or not this is really doable, at least in the short term. Next, you need to test out your model. This is to make sure that your model is viable for the long term, I guess. Is it sustainable? Does it really solve your problem? So like in the case of our birdhouse, we had to make sure like it was water resistant and stuff like that. So this is the sort of stuff you're looking out for. Are there any problems with my model that make it so that it does not solve my problem? That's what you're testing. And finally, you need to redesign and retest. This is to solve any of the problems that you found in this previous step and to make sure no new ones popped up when redesigning. So yeah, I hope you guys find this video informative. And now Hallie will be going into a bit more depth on identifying a problem and how we came up with our problem and stuff. So yeah.
The first step in our engineering process was identifying a problem. Birds are losing their homes. Urbanization largely decreases the areas where birds can safely build a nest. It does not help that stores and other buildings often obstruct potential nesting sites. The second step was planning a solution. To build their nests, birds need a place away from predators and away from harsh weather conditions. The solution of a birdhouse may seem basic, but it's what works. Birdhouses provide all the things needed for a safe nesting spot.
Hi, I'm Daphne and I'm here to talk about building, testing, and redesigning in the engineering process. Today we'll specifically be talking about nest boxes for eastern screech owls.
The third step in the engineering process is building a prototype or a model. For this birdhouse, we'll be using pine or cedar. Don't paint it or treat it with wood preservatives. The wood is just fine as it is. It needs to be 1 inch thick, 10 inches wide, and 8 feet long. As you can see, it's a little less than 10 inches wide, but it's close enough to where you can just say it's 10 inches wide, it'll stay 10 inches wide. Really make sure that you get the slant in between the sides so you can really get that slanty roof. And then make sure as you're measuring it, you mark where you want the drain holes to be in the sides and in the floor, and where you want the hole to be in the front. The drainage holes in the floor will be about 1/4 of an inch, and so will the holes in the sides. And the hole in the front, which will be the entrance hole, obviously, is 3 inches. Before we get to cutting the wood properly, I want to take a moment to talk about safety. So, obviously to cut the wood we'll be using a saw, or anything else that can cut wood, which will obviously be sharp. So just take a moment to make sure that you have all the proper safety procedures in place. Wear shoes, tie any long hair back. Wear safety goggles so that you don't get any wood dust in your eyes. Just make sure that you don't do anything that could potentially lead to any harmful situation. When it comes to cutting the wood, just a few tips. Make sure that nothing is in the way of the saw and the wood that can potentially get you hurt, like fingers. Try to make your cuts quick so that you're not putting unnecessary friction into the wood and therefore applying more heat. So for the side pieces, it gets a little bit more complicated because they do have that diagonal. So I saved those for last just to make it a little bit easier. I have a miter saw, so it makes it a little bit easier to do those diagonals because I can go ahead and set the angle that I want it to cut at. And then once it lined up with the line that I had drawn in the wood, I went ahead and cut it. The next step is the hole in the front of the birdhouse. So I'll be using a jigsaw to cut that. But unfortunately, the jigsaw is not strong enough to get through the entirety of the wood. So before we have to use the jigsaw, I had to drill a hole in the wood to start it off. There are other tools that can cut clean holes in the wood, but we didn't have any and we were unable to get them because of the quarantine. So that's the best we could do, and it worked out just fine. You're going to want to go ahead and drill those drain holes in the floor and in the two sides. So just take any standard drill you have and go ahead and drill those holes. We don't have any clips of this next step because unfortunately the camera did die. But the next step that you have to do is sand it down. So, because of the saws and all that, the wood was pretty rough. So I wanted to make sure that it was as safe as it could be and I wouldn't get any splinters from working with it in the future. So I went ahead and sanded all of the edges that had been cut by the saw. And I also sanded down the hole in the front of the wood down a lot because in the birdhouse, birds will be entering and exiting the house from that hole, so I wanted to make sure that it was as safe as it could be for any of the screech owls that would be living in there. So in case you notice something while sanding, just go ahead and fix that now because you won't be able to in the next. So this step is probably the most complicated step in the entire process, and it is making these individual pieces of wood look like a birdhouse. So we decided to start with connecting the floor and one of the side pieces. The floor has to be a little bit recessed into the birdhouse itself to make sure that it doesn't get damaged by water and is overall protected from weather. So we decided that it would be recessed into the birdhouse about an inch. So we went ahead and put one of the sides underneath the floor when we were drilling it so that we would have that to work off of. In the drilling process, we decided to put it into two steps. We would drill pilot holes in the wood, then line them up, and drill pilot holes in the other piece of wood, then screw it together so that we didn't have to go through a ton of work pressing the screws through two pieces of wood at the same time. So we did this for the floor and the side, then we attached the other side. For the front of the house, you're going to want to put screws both on the bottom and also closer to the top so that you can make sure that the front will really stay on there. And then you're going to attach the back. So you don't want to put the top on during this step. That's going to come in the next step because the process for putting the top on the birdhouse is a little bit different. To attach the top, we're actually going to use a hinge. So it's a little bit different, but this way we can open up the birdhouse and clean it to make sure that it's still sanitary even after birds have. We went with the same process that we did for attaching it, except this time we used a hinge. You can use any type of hinge for this. We just had one lying around, so we used it. We used it for the season. So again, we drilled the pilot holes in the back of the wood and also in the top of the wood. We did have to cut a small section out of the top piece of the birdhouse because the hinge wouldn't cleanly fit, and it would let a bunch of water in. So we did have to chip out that part a little bit. But other than that, we used the pilot hole method and we got the hinge in there correctly. And so it opens and everything's cool.
The fourth step in the engineering process is testing your prototype. I did 2 tests for this birdhouse. I did one to test the weight that it could hold, and one to test how water resistant the top of the birdhouse was. So for the weight test, I found that an eastern screech owl is around 6 ounces. To test the amount of weight and to make sure that the birdhouse would hold when actual birds were in it, I took cans that were around 6 ounces and put around 6 of them into the birdhouse. So I tested it with a weight of 36 ounces. It held, so it had passed the weight test, and there was nothing that I needed to do for that. For the weather test, I took a spray bottle and filled it with water and sprayed the top of it, particularly near where the hinge is, just to make sure that the water wouldn't leak through any small crack that was there. Unfortunately, it did leak, so I had to move on to the 5th step in the engineering process, which is reflect and redesign. So I had to come up with a way to make sure that the top of the birdhouse wouldn't leak. I decided that I would take an old towel and cut up part of it so that it would fit right in between the top of the birdhouse and the back of the birdhouse. In the area where the hinge was, I measured part of a towel and cut it to be the length and width of the wood for the top to make sure that that would fit all of the space and that no water would go in between it. You can do that for any absorbent material. I just suggest that it's thin so that the birdhouse closes all the way. I tested to make sure that the birdhouse closed all the way. It did for the most part, but for what it didn't close for was actually a measuring error from when we were building the birdhouse. So I just roughly taped the towel in there with like Scotch tape because I just needed it to hold for that test, and then I would figure out how to properly attach it. So after I finished my reflect and redesign step, I had to go back to the testing and make sure that it would still or it would pass the weather test. I tested it again, and the inside of the birdhouse was significantly drier, so that solution worked.
Hey guys, thanks for watching the video. I hope you found it informative. Remember, when engineering, identify your problem, come up with a solution, make a model, test the model, and redesign and retest. Have a wonderful day.